Walk It Out. It's actually called Step to the Beat in Europe, which funnily enough, the opening video still calls it Walk It Out. I mean, they changed the logo, but the lady in the video is just like, oh, you're gonna walk it out. But anyways, this is like a really fascinating kind of rhythm walking game by Konami, where essentially you just kind of like step to the beat of the song. So unlike DDR, where you're like putting in different inputs for different directions and things like that, this kind of takes away that element and just says, hey, all we care about is whether you step or not. And it's being presented as like an exercise game, right? So that's what really matters versus like the direction of which you're like stepping like while dancing or something like that, right? But the kind of key aspect to this is that you have to build up points to build out the island. So each successful step that you take along with the beat is something that you get points for to allow you to build things. And what it really does is kind of like gamify walking. So when you start the game, you have like a very barren island. And so what you're building on this island using those points are things like shops, houses, attractions, infrastructure. There's also like things in nature like constellation and plants and things like that as well. And you kind of just like use the Wii remote while walking around to click and point and build things, which actually can be a bit challenging while walking, I feel like sometimes, but as a fairly casual game, I don't think that really gets in the way. But how it actually tracks you walking itself is actually 3 different ways. You can either use the Wii balance board, you can use the DDR pad, or we can use the method I use, which is the nunchuck, which in my opinion is probably the more convenient option, probably the less accurate, since the other two are like tracking an actual step, where the nunchuck is just using general motion to figure out if you're stepping or not. But I will say, you know, most of the time, I felt like the nunchuck was like pretty accurate, but you know, it definitely can feel finicky at times. And I think anytime you introduce the vagueness of motion controls, when you're having a problem like lining up with a song, it can be easy to like start to blame that on the nunchuck, even if it is your own problem of just not being in rhythm with the song itself. But however, despite it being that kind of more casual experience, what building points does is essentially gives you incentive to time yourself to the music. So, you know, when you are playing, you know, it switches between different songs through a playlist, and each of those songs have different beats and things like that, right? So, it you know, where in real life, when you're out walking to music, you know, you have to kind of like tell yourself, I'm gonna walk to different like speeds of music. I think it's like considered a more healthy thing to like walk between different speeds, but I don't really know. Don't ask me. I'm not a health man. I'm a video game man. But you know, essentially that's what kind of helps you do is like those points incentivize you to kind of keep in tune with the song itself. There are things that you can buy on the island that are functional. Most of the things I mentioned earlier are completely aesthetic. So it just, you know, is something you can look at and it's like, cool, I built that. But there are things where like, you know, you start off on like one large island, but there's a secondary island to the side and some smaller other little paths as well that kind of lead off to some things that you can't reach. And so you can build out bridges that help you get to those places. There's also routes that are just kind of artificially locked that you can kind of unlock as well. So it creates new paths and it like makes the world bigger as you play as well. And while you're going around, you can also like buy songs too, and those have the function of like adding songs on. So you collect like, I think it's like 3 pieces of each track, and then once you get all 3, it creates a new song for you. And there's a total of like about 80 songs in the game. And I assume it's like all popular stuff from like the late 2000s or something like that. You know, the Black Eyed Peas is kind of like a big one that they, at least at the start, assuming they don't randomize, but it's a pretty substantial OST. And like, even if you don't care about the late 2000s era music, it has a lot of like Konami DDR style music as well. I assume pulled directly from DDR. I don't know for sure, but it seems very much like something you'd hear in like a DDR machine. But the pacing in which you unlock songs is entirely dependent to you. So you can end up in situations like I did where like the first like, you know, I say weeks of sessions of this game, I kind of more or less had the same soundtrack almost the entire time. And so it did get kind of repetitive, but you know, if you focus on unlocking music over everything else, then you'll get like a more substantial soundtrack, you know, earlier on and things like that. Pacing in general in this game is kind of like a tricky topic because when you play with the default settings, in my opinion, everything like builds up excruciatingly slow. So what that means is basically like the points to buy things is really high. You also have penalties in place if you miss beats, especially with the nunchuck. This can be a little frustrating, where like you get a -1 point for missing a beat, but like thankfully all those things are customizable. You can lower the point cost for buildings, and also if you lose points during like from missing a beat and things like that. So it is like very customizable. You can kind of turn that stuff off, though. I would recommend at least starting with the default settings just to kind of gauge what you want to do with the game, because what this does, in terms of like extending the timeline is, helps you use that game for longer, right? So if you want to play that game for, a whole year or longer for your exercise, then those settings might be actually worth it for you. For me, I wanted something a bit shorter, I feel like, so I ended up about halfway through playing the game, tuning everything down. But the options are there, and you can tune it like even further down. I just think it's better to start from the top and then work your way down rather than immediately start at the bottom, because once you kind of build everything, you largely, get everything you want out of the game, I think, for the most part. Obviously, you can keep playing it afterwards if you want to, but there's like really nothing to do once the world itself is built. It is really cool to see your island like grow, I will say, and especially at the end of it all, like when you're looking at just like where things were at the start and where you ended up. It is pretty satisfying to see, but I will say the game is really bad at emphasizing this throughout the experience itself. You're going to be playing this game for months and months on end, and so a lot of times it can be hard to tell, how much your island has developed in that time. And the game is really bad at emphasizing, the things you're building and making them feel important to build and grow. So like when you build things, the game doesn't like really try to look at the thing that you built. It just kind of like lets it get built off screen behind you. And then also when you finish like a area, so if you're like built out a lighthouse area, there's no like, fanfare of if like you built out that whole area. It's kind of just there now. And I think like some of those presentational aspects of just like literally just down to like camera movement and like saying, hey, look at this, would be, I think, really helpful. And there are things in the game that actually do that. There's like this rainbow you can collect. And then also when you change time, because you can collect these clocks as well that let you change times to different times of day, because events these things you can build actually will be spread out across different times of day and things like that. It will emphasize those things, but it just never does that for building. But building's the most important part of this game. So it's a shame that wasn't something that they opted to kind of like focus on, because I think that would have gone a long way in terms of making the whole process feel satisfying. So what I think you have to do for yourself when you're playing is really set achievable goals. And I don't mean that from like a health perspective, but I mean that from a building perspective. Otherwise, if you just sit there and like click on anything that you can build at any time randomly while walking around the entire island without any thought, the things you're making get kind of lost in all the things that you can build. And so, while you slowly will get there, it doesn't feel like you're making a lot of progress. So, going and being like, I'm going to build out this water fountain area. I'm going to build out this neighborhood. I'm going to build out this apartment complex, things like that. There's a lot of things like that where if you focus on them, it is more satisfying to build things out that way. You can see your progress in more real time. It may take you days and days to build those things still, but at the very least, you can see your progress as you're going through. And when you're done, there's like a sense of like, I'm finally done with this thing. And I just wish the game itself had more of those moments. But the core idea here is like really solid, I will say. I love the idea here. And like, especially if you're in a place where you have extreme temperatures, whether it be extreme hot or, times where you're locked in your house due to the like snow and things like that, this can be a great option to encourage you to keep walking in those moments, though it does do that thing where the game kind of yells at you for not playing every day, which I think is something that I personally have really come to dislike in a lot of these exercise games. They really want you to engage with only that one thing, where I feel like exercising often feels like a multifaceted thing where you're focusing on different things on different days. So to really sit there and kind of like berate you for not checking in each day, I think is like something that these games could be better about. However, I will say, the characters in this game are some of the, like, they're not really characters. I don't even remember their names. But there's like a lady and like a male navigator, I guess you could say, that like talks to you and gives you advice. And their voice acting is like really silly, but at the end of the day, they don't really say anything meaningful. But like probably when they're most personable is when they're giving you a hard time about not coming in. They're like, hey, did you go out with your friends this week? That's fine and all, but I really wish you would have walked too. Stuff like that. So I think like just having like ways to customize the ability to say, how often do I want to check in? What is my goal in interacting with this game? I wish I saw more of that kind of stuff in exercise games. Admittedly, this is like an older one though, so maybe that's something in more recent games as well. But I really think the layers on top of this game really could have been fleshed out in just very slight ways that would have made this like a significantly better experience. But I think the course there is still great. If you're looking for just like that cool, consistent exercise game with walking, I think this is a great option for anyone who is interested. And unfortunately, I don't really know of too many other games like this, so part of me really hopes we see something like Walk It Out again.
Kudos for coming out here every day. Now that's what I call commitment. What is it that drives you? Do you just want to be as healthy as you can be? Are you trying to set new records? Or maybe you just like seeing me? All right, enough joking. Let's get started.